let's get into it. The condition discussed today will be major depressive disorder, which will be referred to in this video as MDD. Also known as clinical depression, unipolar depression, and many other names, MDD is characterized by long duration of pervasive moods such as sadness, emptiness, and/or irritability, such as loss of interest in what once were pleasurable activities for the individual, loss of appetite, and changes in weight, and overall impacts on functioning. This video looks into the impact of functioning, specifically common causes of how MDD and repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation impacts physiological processes. After that, I will tell you how RTMS can be used to treat MDD, and how this stimulation technique also impacts physiological effects. Then, I will provide possible future uses of RTMS based on previous studies and critiques. Now, before I start, I have got to tell you that this should not be used as advice. I'm a uni student doing a presentation for a class, so any questions should be directed to your trusted doctors and medical professionals. Anyway, I'm going to start off by running through the physiological effects of MDD so we get a clearer picture of what we're working with. I'm going to do this quick, so keep up, because this isn't going to be important as the things we're talking about later on. Firstly, we got reduced brain volume in areas related to emotional processing and excess of white matter hyperintensity, and an enlargement of the pituitary gland. This study, as you can see, presents a systematic review and meta-regression analyses on the preceding structural MRI studies, meanwhile comparing major depressive disorder with bipolar depression, with healthy volunteers as a control variable. From this, they found that unipolar depression caused reduced brain volume, specifically where emotional processing was correlated. Among this were indications of excess white matter hyperintensity in unipolar depressive individuals and the augmentation of the pituitary gland. Second, we got hyperactivity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and connections between the three networks linked by the dorsal nexus. This study discovered that the cognitive control network, affective network, and default mode networks were all connected by the bilateral dorsal medial prefrontal cortex region, called dorsal nexus. This possibly illustrates how symptoms of MDD arise in specific networks, specifically how these symptoms interact at the same time. Interestingly, this could mean that the dorsal nexus presents a potential as a target for therapy. Thirdly, we got neurotransmitter systems altered through reduced synaptic availability and receptor density, as well as glutamate imbalance. The glutamate imbalances are evident in Lucia and Shen and Sahia's 2011 review on preclinical and clinical studies. This review analyzes and summarizes 3 studies and finds evidence of GABAergic deficiency causality in major depressive disorders. We also got circadian rhythm disturbances and overall insomnia. This review finds sleep and circadian rhythms, where it found sleep disturbances were largely moderated by age and gender. It was found that depressed males possessed low slow wave activity, which is the deepest stage of sleep, aka NREM. And it correlated with common melancholic depression symptoms. This did not impact females, but it was found that women had low temporal coherence in sleep EEGs, which is basically how consistent the waves were when being measured. And metabolic dysfunction. Like many others on this list, metabolic dysfunction has heaps of sub-branches of factors. I'm just going to look at 2. Overall systematic metabolic dysfunction and inflammation. These 2 are bidirectionally linked in a weird way. Metabolic dysregulation promotes inflammation, and as a very kind thank you, inflammation says, yeah, whatever, and impairs metabolic regulation. Alright, now we're getting onto the goodies! I'm talking about non-invasive brain stimulation techniques, let's go! Specifically, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. RTMS manipulates magnetic pulses to stimulate targeted nerve cells in the areas we talked about before, to regulate mood and are usually underactive. If you were to undergo RTMS, they'll really just put your head under an electromagnetic coil and the magic works from there. Alright, let's get into how RTMS physiologically influences MDD. But first, we're going to get familiar with RTMS and its physiological impacts on us. I'm going to keep this short because I cannot wait to get onto the good stuff. So I can't include all the physiological changes. Don't worry though, you won't be missing out on any important details. Now, firstly, we got modulating of the cortical excitability. This one can go either way, as it can facilitate or inhibit depending on the frequency and protocols. We got modulating of neurotransmitter systems, GABA and glutamate, serotonin and noradrenaline, dopamine in striatum and prefrontal and frontal cortex. GABA and glutamate measured by MRS, but it was to record the underlying neuronal mechanisms. This study also found that inhibitory stimuli caused reduced glutamatergic neuronal activity in correlation with GABA reduction. Endogenous dopamine release was found to be induced by our friend RTMS after being zapped onto the prefrontal cortex. Thanks for making us happier, RTMS. And we got changes in serotonin and noradrenaline were indirectly reported when Bacon et al. 2015 wanted to see whether high-frequency RTMS had a response on the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. It did, if you wanted to know. We got inducting of synaptic plasticity-like changes. The study, as you see, investigates the effects of RTMS on cortical excitability and inhibition. They found that low-frequency RTMS gives off a transient reduction in cortical excitability. High-frequency RTMS increased the size of motor-evoked potentials and reduced cortical inhibition. We got regional metabolic changes. I'm talking about increases of regional cerebral blood flow, which in turn impact the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate gyrus, the left amygdala, bilateral insula, basal ganglia, uncus, hippocampus, parahippocampus, thalamus, and cerebellum. We got modulation of stress hormones. We also got changes in inflammatory markers, but there's a lack of data on that so far. Then there's also possible changes in circadian rhythms through RTMS to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. As you would have probably noticed, there's a lot of physiological processes of MDD that are addressed in the use of RTMS, such as the cortical excitability and synaptic plasticity-like changes, and moderation of GABAergic and glutamatergic functioning. We talked about the use of TMS on the modulating of GABAergic and glutamatergic functioning, and according to the study, it can be influenced. However, this study used MRS to record the motor evoked potentials, and MRS is bound by its limited spatial and chemical resolution, so it's definitely possible, but not definitive. As stated, the inducting of cortical excitability and synaptic plasticity-like changes are evident when RTMS is targeted at the prefrontal area. As this is thought to do so, this can improve the top-down regulation of limbic structures associated with mood regulation. However, there's a lack of data on the efficacy of these findings. Therefore, there is no definitive causality between induced plasticity and clinical benefit. Regulation of neurotransmitters. We see this in how endogenous dopamine release was spotted after the use of RTMS on the prefrontal cortex, as well as changes in serotonin and noradrenaline when RTMS was blasted onto the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex. So we know that RTMS impacts the monoaminergic system, and this could benefit the lack of communication between the regions associated with emotional regulation. However, like the first couple of points, the technology use is limited by spatial and chemical resolution. A lot of these studies were also small in sample size and confounded by medicine, so the efficacy of RTMS on the regulation of neurotransmitters remains debated. Cerebral blood flow and metabolism. RTMS, from the evidence I told you about before, showed increases in regional cerebral blood flow amongst a variety of areas. These increases produce longer-term metabolic changes and may possibly even equalize dysfunctional metabolic patterns prevalent in MDD. But once again, this data is limited by small sample sizes. It's also difficult to figure out what is cause versus effect in these studies, so it's not black and white, in determining clinical use. Now, looking at these studies and critiques, we know what may or may not be possible in the future. Firstly, more research with larger sample sizes on cerebral blood flow, metabolism, and neurotransmitters. There needs to be more research in general about cortical excitability and synaptic change, as this information could be massive in bringing RTMS to effective use. Methods for clearer imaging of these post-RTMS changes could provide more clarity and evidence supporting its use as well. And that's all I've got. We can see how RTMS definitely has potential to become a mainstream clinical device aimed at restoring regular functions of the human body. But there just isn't enough data to support it yet, especially in sampling sizes and imaging techniques. research definitely needs to head that way. And maybe soon enough, we could have an effective therapy solution for MDD. Thanks for listening.